So I would say most people I have met in all my years of going inside prison have experienced trauma. Not all, certainly, not all, but have very high rates of trauma.
Hey Kathy, how's it going?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. So I wanted to
Awesome.
talk to you today because I'm very interested in sort of the criminal justice system of Vermont, with Vermont as sort of um, a northeastern uh, state. We have sort of ideas of Vermont as the pinnacle of liberalism in the U.S.
Hmm.
And I think in my past interview with Mia Schultz of the Rutland, Vermont NAACP, and then through sort of past data that I've seen, it sort of challenged my idea of Vermont and sort of made me rethink some of the stereotypes I have of the Northeast and Vermont and stuff like that. And so I just wanted to talk to someone like you who's
Hmm.
very knowledgeable about just the criminal justice system in general and specifically in Vermont. Sort of your about what you do and sort of for more information on it.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I've been studying criminal justice for 20 something years, and I didn't start until I came to Vermont, actually, from California. And I at the moment am studying prison culture and climate, but in the past I have studied reentry, specifically what happens to people as they're being released from prison, and it something that didn't get very much attention until the last 20 years or so, which is interesting because reentry as an issue or a social problem is one that's created by mass incarceration, right? So, it's 640,000 people are released every year from prison. So, there's a massive exodus. Most people are released. So, the problem of like how to reintegrate people, it became apparent to the federal government about 20 years ago. And part of it is because they used to just give you $20 and a bus ticket and tell you good luck. And, the people came back over and over and over again, and they still do, because we didn't do anything to help them. So I became pretty interested in that topic generally, and there was a lot of movement at the federal level around that. And then in particular, Vermont had an unusual program called Circles of Support and Accountability, CoSA for short, which is the idea of sort of a radical inclusion model of accepting people as they're released from prison and providing them with supports. And so I studied that for a while.
Very interesting. So with you said circles of support and accountability. Um, what does that program sort of entail? Can you go maybe
Yeah,
a little bit deeper on like
sure.
what people's responsibility to
Yeah,
support or something like that?
yeah, sure. So it was started in Canada, and it was, mainly for high risk offenders who were being released who were considered high risk of sexually reoffending, and communities being nervous about having them and in their communities. And so this church basically sort of decided to wrap supports around this guy, just to make the whole situation okay. And so it's used pretty widely in Canada and the UK, not that much in the US. And for some reason, Vermont just really embraced it. And Vermont, even though it's a tiny state, and only has about 1,100 people incarcerated in the whole state, they have done more circles of support than all the other states combined. They've been doing it for a long time. So how it works is if a person is deemed either medium or high risk of reoffending based on these, you know, uh, statistical calculations, then and they seem in need of supports, like maybe they're isolated, and that's why generally people who've committed sexual offenses, a lot of times they're pretty isolated. Then through our community justice centers, which we have a whole network of, they get volunteers, like 3 to 5 volunteers, who will commit to meeting regularly with this person for a year, and helping support them as they navigate, trying to get a job and trying to manage all the restrictions that they have and things like that. And it's a pretty cool model. I found it to be, it can work better or worse, depending on all the characters involved. But generally, I found that it was pretty successful when people committed and were all in. And the reason it was successful, I felt, is because people who had been incarcerated were sort of first incredulous that strangers would care and didn't want anything from them, and like, what's your game? What are you up to? What do you want from me? And then they, over time, developed just a healthy relationship, friendship, kind of, and one of mutual obligation. So a lot of the people who they're called the core member, the person who was released from prison, they would say that they didn't want to let the people down. They felt, really committed to sort of, honoring those obligations. And so it was kind of a profound but simple model, I think, that I believe could and should be replicated widely.
Okay, and so you said that through this model of volunteers working with a core member, a person that's recently released from prison, that through working with them, you've seen good results. The data, does the data reflect that, like based off of your sort of history with reentry, that maybe people who do this program, are you seeing that they end up going back to prison, or is it really helping them greatly in that regard?
Well, so the quantitative data that I have are not that great, meaning that I have a request in for some data and I haven't gotten it yet. But the data out of Canada show that it reduces recidivism fairly substantially. And Vermont has an opportunity to do a lot more analysis of the data. What I did was a series of interviews with people about sort of trying to understand why it works or how it works. People felt that it was about the fact that it was volunteers and community members and relationships that they formed, and kind of the modeling of like what a relationship looks like when you're just trying to help someone and not judging them. So the motto of CoSA is no one is disposable and no more victims. So the idea is obviously to help this person, but in part with an eye towards making sure that they don't victimize someone else. So that's the accountability piece. But I would argue that you can't really, that support has to happen first, and accountability comes through the moral authority that you establish through this, genuine, authentic relationship.
Okay. And so you were saying earlier that when it first started in Canada, it was more so, it started for specifically sex offenders.
Right.
In Vermont, was that the same case when it was used, or did it apply to other offenders?
No, and Vermont's one of the few places that has used it for all kinds of offenses. So it only had to do with the assessment of someone's likelihood to reoffend, and also their need. And but like in the UK, it's only used for sex offenders. Australia, it's only used for sex offenders. I think the Netherlands uses it for other things as well. But the part of it was very hard to release sex offenders to communities without there being a lot of backlash, unless you had some sort of system in place that would make the community feel more secure. And so that was part of the impetus behind it originally. But then it became clear that it's a model that there's nothing specific about it that would make it only viable for people who committed sexual offenses.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel as if you know, Western governments around the world are even doing enough in terms of reentry for different offenders? Like, do you perhaps think that like in Canada or the UK, maybe it should be extended to all types of offenders and not necessarily just for the community itself, but for
Yeah.
the on the sake of the offender?
Yes, yes, and yes. I think that everyone benefits from someone getting support when they are released from prison. And to the extent that we can welcome people back, some people might sort of cynically think, okay, good, we can keep our eyes on this person because there are more eyes on them.
Right.
But it's for me, and studying reentry for a while, it's more about how in the world do we expect people to succeed when they're released, from what are increasingly long prison sentences, and with now a criminal record and all the sort of collateral consequences that come from a felony conviction, and trying to get housing, trying to get a job, all those things. How do we expect people to succeed? It's incredibly daunting. I'm always amazed when people do succeed. So I think our system is actually set up in a way that makes recidivism completely predictable, and inevitable, I think. So yeah, I would say the social supports and the destigmatization of welcoming people back, and helping them navigate life on the outside, which is so different from life on the inside. There's no downside to me to
Right.
that.
Right. And as a sociologist that knows a lot about maybe the reasons behind maybe what state governments are thinking when they put together prisons and things like that. Was there because you were talking about how daunting it is for offenders when they get out of prison and how they sort of end up back in prison and in these situations. In the current system we have now, nationally, ignoring CoSA in Vermont, was there sort of a rationale for the current system we have for sort of how difficult it is to figure yourself out when you're back on the outside, or was that sort of an afterthought?
Well, gosh, that is such a complicated question because there's a lot of different sort of perspectives on that. I think we tend to have a view that a lot of people say stems from the sort of religious roots of the creation of the nation state, that that there are good people and bad people, there's good and evil and all these sorts of things, so that we tend to think that if someone did some harm to someone, that then they're just a bad person, and you have to look out for them. Our system is also designed on the idea that if we make it harsh enough, then it will deter people. And so if we add on all these things, like you can't get a job, you can't do these, get licenses for certain kinds of things, that will deter people. But there's no evidence to support that by virtue of the fact that we have 2 million people incarcerated, and our recidivism rate is, almost 70%. So, it's irrational. It's an irrational system in my opinion. And I think, it also stems from, the early origins of incarceration, which stem from, slave patrols and, it has white supremacist roots.
Interesting. Is Do you think there's a reason as to why we've continued to perpetuate sort of this, draconian system when there's a lot of evidence behind, programs like CoSA and, systems in maybe Canada and the UK working?
Yeah, I think, one thing that's important to bear in mind is that Canada and the UK, much less so than the US, but they still have a regular prison system. It's not that they're completely enlightened. Comparatively, yes, but the UK incarcerates a fairly high number of people as well. It's a mystery to me that people don't know the literature. They don't know what works. They don't know what doesn't work. And even legislators, I think a lot of people assume that law enforcement and harsh punishment works, and that if, to the extent that we have crime, it's because we're not harsh enough. We need to, people need longer sentences. They need worse conditions. They need, more restrictions. They need, and there simply is not evidence to support that. Ask any criminologist. So, it's true that if you incarcerate somebody for 20 years, during those 20 years, they won't be able to be out in the community, wreaking havoc or whatever. But in terms of how we're releasing people, like, are they better, off in a better state when they're released? There's, you only have to look at our recidivism rate to have proof of that. So, but I think a lot of people can use that evidence and say, well, that just shows you some people are really bad and they're just going to stay bad. And, I just don't think that that's what's going on.
Yeah. I think something I sort of think of is the concept of revenge in the criminal justice system. And to me, that seems as if it's the only reason maybe why our system is how it is. And also tagging along to sort of what you said about sort of, this religious nation state that we sort of started with and are currently in. But yeah, I think, for someone to spend, 40 years in prison for maybe, for example, selling drugs or something, I feel like, that's nothing but the thought of maybe people that are harmed by the crime, wanting to get some sort of revenge on the person that committed the crime or something like that.
Yeah, and the one thing that's really interesting about that, and I've really come to understand this in the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, is that part of the reason I think people want revenge is because there's no other option for them, So if I'm harmed, then I really serve as a witness in the state's case against whoever harmed me, right? There's nothing about that process that makes me whole or makes me, repairs the harm, right? So, the person might go to jail, they have a plea agreement, they might, something might happen to them, but there's, they never say they're sorry. I never get to confront them. So I think that people want revenge because that's the only option. They don't know what else to do with the emotion that they have. And one of the things that's really interesting about restorative justice is that the research shows that most victims of crimes or harms just want an apology, a sincere apology. And so, if they could get that, a lot of times the need for revenge just dissipates. And so I think it's partly about having an alternative system of justice that would actually better meet the needs of people who are victimized anyway, and also cause less harm to the people who committed the crime.
Hmm. What is restorative justice? Could you give an explanation of what exactly that is?
Yeah, there's a lot of different definitions, and a lot of different kinds of processes, but generally the thinking is that a crime is actually a fracturing of a relationship between, I mean, even if they're strangers, right? And that one person harms another person, and that the really, rather than the state being the harmed party, or stepping in for the person, that it really needs to be about repairing that relationship. And so what that would mean is, that the victim would sit in a room, and tell the person how they were affected by what happened, and with lots of preparation. And then the person who did the harm would, hopefully and ideally, understand the impact of what they did, and then issue an apology. It just humanizes the whole process, and they're speaking to one another rather than lawyers speaking on behalf of people. And I think it has a better chance of having an impact on the person who committed the harm when they really see that there was a human who was afraid, or somehow their situation was damaged in the process. So it can have a bigger impact on people than just sending them to jail, in part because that just makes people angry. And so it just fuels their rage, and their sense of themselves as victims, rather than identifying someone else as having been the victim or the harmed party.
Interesting. A lot of that definitely seems quite not radical for me, but maybe radical for America at
Yes.
large. The
Yes.
idea of taking a therapy type approach to it and sort of repairing relationships. My question is, how did you get involved with the idea of restorative justice, and is it sort of is your involvement with it purely theoretical, or do you also have practice with it out in prisons or in the
Yeah.
criminal justice system?
Well, that's a really good question. So when I started studying reentry in Vermont, somebody at the Department of Corrections said, you should look at what the community justice centers are doing. They're doing these very cool, the CoSAs, but also reparative boards. So community boards will deal with low-level offenses. So like the police will refer people straight to the justice center. The state's attorney will, send people to it, to try to keep them out of the criminal justice system, for one thing. And then also just to handle it at a community level, right? So that the relationship, it may not be, you may not necessarily think of it between those two people, but like the community, right? How is the community harmed when something happens, right? So that's how I started studying CoSAs. And now I teach about restorative justice. I went to New Zealand for a while, that has a very robust restorative justice system. And I don't, because I'm still doing research, I don't participate in restorative justice processes, because I just try to keep those things separate. That said, I do a lot of volunteer work at the local prison, in part because I feel this strong desire to let people know that are incarcerated that there are people on the outside that care about them and want them to succeed in the community. So, that's, I mean, it's a small thing, but it's a way of trying to restore the people back to the community that have done, harms.
Right, right. But I think I'm specifically interested in the idea of the sort of intimate idea of being in the same room as someone
Mhm.
that committed a crime onto you, and
Yeah.
for them to express remorse for that. And if you accept that remorse, you sort of let bygones be bygones. Um, Aside from CoSAs themselves, or I don't know if that's even in the purview of CoSAs, but specifically pertaining to that, is that something that happens
Yes.
in the real world?
Yes. Yes. There are cases where you know, relationship where even when something serious has happened, a serious harm, um, where people the victim and the person who did the harm become friends, or make peace, and ask that the person not be punished further. And so I think that there's an emotional and moral satisfaction that happens, that when someone is acknowledging your harm. I mean, the problem with the traditional court system is that there's nobody acknowledging your harm. As a victim, you're peripheral to the process. um and so it's flawed at the most basic level in terms of human need, I think. And I was a victim of a crime many years ago, and what was interesting is I did not want the person to be punished. I just wanted to sit in a room with him and just sort of ask him, like, you know why, and how did, like, I really wanted to understand it, and that would have been enough for me. So I think there was always a part of me that was sort of knew that there was a better way, probably.
Hmm. And through your time that you spent volunteering in prisons, have you gotten a better idea of maybe why people perpetuate crimes? Have you gotten better with understanding, in a way that most of us on the outside wouldn't understand, sort of um, having empathy for offenders and prisoners, and sort of understanding their stories?
Yes. And I'm part of a research project too, that's run by the Urban Institute, and it's called the Prison Research and Innovation Network. And my research partner and I, Abby Crocker, do these surveys, um, and it conforms to the existing data out there. But people who are incarcerated have very high ACE scores, which are adverse childhood experiences or events. And so childhood trauma, they have very high scores. And so I would say most people I have met, in all my years of going inside prison, have experienced trauma. Not all, certainly not all, but have very high rates of trauma. So, for example, somebody, if they had childhood trauma, they might self medicate, develop a substance use disorder, and then find themselves doing financial crimes or things like that, end up in prison, have their children taken away. And it really, to me, is that the adults in their lives failed them somehow, and then we punish them for that. And which is not to say that, I understand that they did something wrong and all that. But I would say that the problem is, we don't, as a society, we don't address these things upstream, before people end up in the system. And you know, that to me is behind most of the people that I've met. That is what's behind their crimes.
Mm. So can you sort of elaborate on, um, based off of, everything that you've learned as an academic on this, what, the sort of utopia would look like in terms of focusing on if we were able to focus more so on this sort of childhood trauma that a lot of
Yeah.
offenders have, and you said about sort of being more preventative.
Yeah.
What would that sort of look like to you?
Well, I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, I would. I mean, we need to invest in communities. That's what people always say, right? But what does that mean? What that means is, having a safety net for people, right? So, if you're a parent that's working two jobs and you're stressed and you're struggling, and so you're lashing out at your children in ways that maybe you don't want to, we need to offer supports for people like that in terms of, um, you know, uh, I mean, people shouldn't have to be working two jobs for a livable wage, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with the stresses that accompany poverty, and which is not to say that people who are not in poverty, don't have stresses or don't, act out against their children, but I think that offering parenting support, offering, having communities that care for one another, and really functional communities, right? There's a lot of reasons that we don't have totally functional communities. And I mean, I don't know, so much of that seems like it's gotten worse in recent years. We don't trust one another. We're more hostile towards strangers. But I think I think those kinds of things, if we had truly a safety net, where people could get mental health care, I think that would be huge as well. So, the a large proportion of people with serious mental illness who end up committing crimes for various reasons end up in prison rather than a facility that's more appropriate to help them heal from whatever is going on with them. I think that's probably the biggest failure that we have, because it's not an appropriate place for them, and then they'll be released. So
Right. So it seems as if you're saying that where there are sort of some failings within communities to sort of be that initial buffer for young people or children, there should at least be a system in place where maybe the local government or federal government would have mental health services to sort of mitigate those issues before actual prisons are involved.
yeah. And so that's why it's a daunting problem, right? Because there's like, there's stuff about income inequality, access to guns, the drug trade, lack of mental health services, lack of, livable wage, all these things, and healthcare, right? I mean, healthcare costs, all these things, create a perfect storm for, um, you know, crime, really. And so I think that's, I guess, why we as a society don't really go about fixing this. But I guess the idea that we would just incarcerate our way out of these problems, I mean, it makes no sense to me. And I think the evidence supports that it's a very, very, very expensive proposition. And, like, we could give people who don't have houses, we could give them houses for cheaper than we're paying for prison cells.
Hmm. I'm actually quite curious about that too. Just the idea of within reentry. If I'm someone that's coming out of prison, how do I find housing? And do you know of programs where they could find housing? What's the sort of setup
Yeah.
right now?
Well, I mean, it's actually significantly better than it was 20 years ago, because there have been a lot of federal resources put towards, housing supports. There's a lot of agencies and organizations that help people as they're re-entering, like they negotiate with landlords, to help them, give them a chance and things like that. And that just really did not exist, 20 years ago. Um, but usually if you're trying to get out of prison and you're calling a landlord, it'll say you're receiving a call from state penitentiary or whatever, or state prison. It's like not conducive to getting an apartment. And I think a lot of it, how do you get an apartment? How do you put down first, last, and security deposit when maybe if you're working in prison, you might be getting $1 a day or $5 a day, or you can't, and you probably have court fees and fines and all kinds of other things. So it's kind of impossible, right?
Right.
But there are more of those kinds of supports to try to help people get apartments, for example. But you can see why people end up back inside.
Right, right. But it's something I see as an issue, and um, maybe I'm the only one that sees this as an issue. But I've always found that like programs, whatever that type of quote unquote program may be, whether it's a housing program, whether it's something like CoSA, I always wonder how it doesn't matter the type of person I am. How would I find out about different programs? You don't really see you know like commercials for housing
Mm-hmm.
programs and stuff, and sort of going back to what we said about sort of communities, maybe break it down a little bit, and with respect to that, sort of what seems to have taken place of these communities is us being on like our phones a lot, and spending a lot of time looking at what celebrities are doing, and
Yep.
stuff like that, and sort of watching stuff on YouTube or whatever have you. And I just don't know how I would learn about like different programs going on in my local
Right.
community.
Well, you'd probably have to be pretty proactive, right? And contact the United Way to get a list of all the nonprofits, contact the housing authority, um, you know, uh, contact, the whatever community development office there is, which most cities have. I think that one thing I will say that I find really heartening is I've been teaching for 28 years, which is a really long time. And students now are more engaged in issues around police reform, criminal justice reform, um, all these kinds of issues, and they want to get involved. Like they definitely want to do something, way more than students in past years, I think. And some of that is, I think, a function of social media.
Mm,
That with they saw horrific things happen, right, to people like George Floyd, and that so there actually can be a positive side, I think, of some of that. The recording that people are doing, and then when you see it, you get outraged. It's different than reading about it. And but I will say that this generation coming up is way more engaged and pissed off, and so I feel more optimistic about them as they enter positions of power than I have in the past.
yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely see a lot of movements, bigger sort of political movements than I mean even I saw in most of my life. I was born in 1995, and you know, even growing up, maybe watching TV or something. If the news would come on, growing up, you never saw anything about a riot, or you never saw news on CNN really about protests, maybe until
Mhm.
like 2015 with Michael Brown, and then as that sort of kind of started things off, and since then, sort of my life in terms of what I see on the news has completely changed.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, I mean, the downside of what like local news covers is a lot of crime, right? So people often have a sense that crime is more rampant than it is. They have a distorted sense of it.
Hmm.
And you know, since most people, like most people your age, are not necessarily watching the news, right? They're getting their news from somewhere on their phone, and their algorithm is sending them, you know, certain things. So if you know, if you're interested in information about protests or, you know, police brutality or something like that, that you know, you'll keep getting sent stuff, right? So you I think um it can help to energize people, I think, if they don't get overwhelmed.
Right. I think a lot of people, maybe me included, are kind of like skeptical about the you know the U.S. system, and you know sometimes I watch videos. I was watching this one video about how um, you know uh, the way that legislation passes in the U.S. Um, um, isn't sort of motivated or affected by the will of the people, and it is much more affected by the will of, you know, maybe big donors or big corporations and stuff. Um, and so I guess my question to you is, um, you know, you've seen, I'm sure a lot of things change, whether, you know, locally in Vermont on a criminal justice level, and also nationally. Do you see, with your work in criminal justice, do you see it as something that can change in a very positive way, maybe nationally in our lifetimes?
Yes, and I think you already see it with the softening of possession laws, for example. You know, and states willing to defy the federal government. You know, I think you see different things depending on what's happening in that moment. So, for example, now nationally, I don't think criminal justice is a big issue or crime, right? But at the local level, it is. And, you know, just as an example, our state's attorney is a reform prosecutor, and she was just up for reelection, and she won by a lot. But the rhetoric was that was going around against her was about that, you know, crime is up, and it's because of reform-minded prosecutors. So you have, you know, like the recall of the prosecutor in San Francisco, you know. So you know, there's these moments where you know, it seems like things are becoming more reform minded and something will happen, and then it's not, you know. And it goes back and forth, but I think overall, over time, um uh I think to the extent that we provide people with alternatives, then um and impress upon them the cost, I mean, like the fiscal cost of the true economic cost, then you will you know, bring in people that otherwise might not be engaged, right? So I think you can get liberals and conservatives to agree about some level of reform. I mean, you know, I mean, I don't know how much, right? But I think, and I especially think as young people now who are much more tuned into these issues, uh, you know, become CEOs and legislators and, you know, power brokers and all the different things, they will probably change things. I think it will change. I think we need to get some of my generation out, you know. You know,
Right.
but we all grew up with the war on drugs, right? I mean, and the war on crime and the war on everybody, and you know, it like uh I think anybody who's paying attention is pretty cynical about that whole movement.
Hmm. And so, yeah, and I definitely do agree that, you know, my generation and younger are definitely quite interested in the issue of criminal justice and police reform. What was sort of the landscape and environment like in terms of what people were interested in when you were going to college, when you first became interested in
Mm.
sort of criminal justice, and were you seen as like an outlier for being interested in that sort of thing?
Yes, and I still am. I still I meet people that will say, "Ooh, why do you study prisons?" Because I mean, it's so unpleasant relative to other things that I could be studying, right? Um, a lot of people, we do keep all of this behind closed doors, right? Literally behind closed doors. And so, even though courtrooms are public, most people don't go to court except to watch Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, right? But we don't go to court, we don't engage in any of that, we don't know. I would say that I mean, I'm in Vermont, right? So it's hard to say. People are very interested in environmental issues, climate change, rightfully so. Um, I don't I really think it was they were concerned about that. They were concerned about, I mean, early on, people were concerned about apartheid. They were concerned about the war in Iraq. They were, there were other things going on. But I really think it's the advent of social media that has prompted the interest in criminal justice reform. But uh, yeah, I mean, I lived in Oakland during the crack war, and there were, helicopters flying overhead, police helicopters. It was very intense during that time period. So, I mean, I saw the war on drugs. And I just don't think most people, that most students hadn't really witnessed or observed that. They sort of knew that but they didn't really know. I still tell them, I say there are people in jail or in prison now for possession, like in Oklahoma, for example, and I think they can't believe it. But it's like it really was a different time. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does, or it definitely tells me a lot.
Yeah.
You spoke about Oklahoma, um, and I do think because I look at sort of incarceration statistics from the sentencing project a lot, and
Yeah.
um, I saw that like states like Oklahoma and Louisiana are quite are some of the highest when it comes to like incarceration rates.
Hmm.
Um, do you see that as something that is going down? Is it something that's changing over time, or?
It is a little bit. If you look at the statistics, I mean, the overall incarceration rate is going down a little bit. It's not going down, as fast as I would have expected, I guess. Because I think we reached this tipping point where, it just got absurd. I mean, we have, I think, 4% of the world's population in the United States, but 25% of the incarcerated population of the world. So, we really incarcerate a lot of people. But I do think that southern states, mostly southern states, are pretty attached to their sense of law and order and what justice is. And, it does seem to be kind of a conservative liberal divide. So I don't know what would happen in some of those states, right? That still have capital punishment, for example, and have no interest in getting rid of it.
Hmm. Sometimes I think of the Constitution, and don't quote me on this. I am not like someone that knows a lot about the Constitution, but isn't there an amendment that talks about no undue punishment,
Yeah,
or something like
uh,
that, or
yeah.
no
The Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. Yes.
cruel and unusual punishment? Do you think what's your opinion on that as it relates to sort of our criminal justice landscape in America?
Yeah. Um. Well, it. I'll just tell you a story. There was, the three strikes laws that got passed in the 90s, most notably in California, made it possible for people to serve 25 to life for their third felony, right? And there was a test case at the Supreme Court. A guy had stolen $600 of golf clubs, I think. And people were watching this thinking like, well, and it was an Eighth Amendment challenge saying this is cruel and unusual punishment. He got, I think, life and his third felony was, $600. And, I would have bet money that it would have been overturned and they would say, no, this is disproportionate, and that it's cruel and unusual punishment. And the Supreme Court upheld it and said that it doesn't have to do with that particular offense. Yes, it would be if it was that offense, but it's about him being this recalcitrant, incorrigible offender. And so that the sentence wasn't too harsh then. So I think I think the use of solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment. The UN calls it torture, basically. The human rights organizations call it torture. But we are extremely punitive in this country, and so, there are many times that I would think that something would be considered disproportionate. So, for example, getting 10 years in prison for marijuana possession, which you could get in Oklahoma. I don't know that you still can, but that seems disproportionate to me, right? And the logic of the system was that punishment should be proportional, that's what justice is, eye for an eye. So you wouldn't take someone's eye out for stealing a pack of gum, right? But we have a different calculation about those kinds of things in this country.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the average sentence in the United States is 5 times longer than that of Europe, most of Europe, for the same crime. So what they consider proportional and what we do is really different. And a lot of places have kind of the max sentence would be like 14 years. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. I guess sort of maybe my last question is, if based off of, your research, America has a far way to go. What is maybe the sort of criminal justice systems through your research in different countries that you look up to? Are there specific countries like Canada or?
Yep. Well, there are places I have heard, I have never been to Africa, but where communities, I mean, so these are villages, more small communities, they do what we would consider restorative justice, which is, the community sits together in a circle and, confronts the person who did whatever the harm is, and they may sanction them, they may send them away for a while, and then bring them back and welcome them back, right? That model makes sense to me. How you do that in a large, complex, industrialized society with, where, I mean, I don't know how you scale that. I would say that Germany and Scandinavian countries, specifically Norway, have really different approaches to how they incarcerate people. So they still incarcerate people, for serious things, murder and sexual assault and things like that. But they try to make it what they call normalized, in the sense of make it as much like, home life as is possible, because the argument is that losing your liberty is the punishment itself. So the fact that you can't go home at night, the fact that you can't see your family at night, that is the punishment, and that there's no reason to pile on, right? So I think systems like that are, to my mind, just really recognizing and honoring the essential humanity of every person and dignity of every person, those would be a step in the right direction. Uh, and um, and that, yeah, that's what I would say. If we could be more like those countries, that would be awesome.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly interesting, and especially the idea of just really incorporating restorative justice on sort of a national level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I don't know that you know, I don't know if we would ever do that. And the question is, what a lot of people, the critique is, if you have this criminal justice system and then you have this parallel restorative justice system, how are they supposed to work together? And are you really dismantling the traditional system if you just have this parallel system that sometimes gets used, but not for things very serious? And, like, how would you transform the justice system so that it became somehow more uh you know restorative? And so a, a lot of critics will say that we need something that is considered what they call transformative justice, which is very different and would operate outside of sort of the traditional state actors, the state systems, and would be more community based.
I think sounds amazing, but we need a lot of political will to make something like that happen.
Yes, we would. And you can get a lot of votes by being, tough on crime, right? So still less so than 20 years ago, but still. So yeah, we have a ways to go.
Yeah. Well, Kathy Fox, thank you so much for all of your knowledge on your field, and thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure.